something that I wrote. Actually, I've revised it since I originally wrote it in the spring, in March of 2015. It's called Footprints Found Inside in Cold Blood. I guess maybe I ought to back up for just a second. In 2012, in November, when I first went up to the Kansas State Historical Society to look at the Hickok and Smith files, especially Hickok's, because my father's story was written almost entirely based on interviews and written correspondence that Dick Hickok provided MACK nations with. Perry Smith was not a party to this. He was not interviewed by my dad. He wouldn't let people interview him. He was terribly, terribly paranoid and very disturbed. Anyway, Hickok was a person that liked to talk. He probably talked too much. But anyway, he was the one that initiated this whole thing between my father and him in the writing of this book called High Road to Hell. And there was a contract, legal contract, binding contract, that was made between Richard Hickok and MACK nations by an attorney in Garden City named Dale Corley. Dale Corley was Richard Hickok's first appointed appeal attorney after the conviction of the murders of the Clutters in March of 1960. It was Dale Corley in Garden City that drew this contract up, and according to Hickok, was signed May 7th, 1961, between MACK nations and himself regarding this story of his life story, including the murders of the Clutter family. It wasn't MACK nations that contacted Richard Eugene Hickok. It was really the other way around. And after that contract began in May, the interviews and the letters that my father got with Hickok just kind of came one right after the next. Anyway, let me go back to this. In 2012, the Kansas Historical Society asked me to put together a little biography about my dad and my mom. I did that. I put that up there. I gave it to him to put it up there. I think there's something online about my father, not exactly correct. My father never, I think they mixed up my grandfather, his dad, with my father. My dad never played an instrument, musical instrument in his life. His grandfather did. He played both violin and organ. Anyway, I guess it's neither here nor there, but I just remember that, reading that here on that site about my dad, so I guess I wanted to just say that as a correction. Anyway, I wrote in December of 2012, after I came home, had the near 100 copies of what I found up there in the file on Hickok that was directly related to my father. It was amazing. It's just absolutely amazing. I guess the person that put that stuff in that file just never figured that anybody who knew anything about this or knew anything about my dad would ever look in there. I mean, it has been 1965, so what is that? 50 years, 50 some years since they were executed. So anyway, but I found it and I copied it, and then I asked permission from the agency to republish it, and I got their permission to do that, and that's why it's in my memoir, or my expose, if you will. Anyway, that's how that started. But the first thing that I wrote in December of 2012 was called The Origins of In Cold Blood, and it was based solely on the information that I found inside the HICKOCK file that linked my father to him, and there's a whole lot to that nobody knows about. And now I'm just going to read something from something I wrote about a year and a half ago, and went in and kind of added some things to it here recently. Footprints found inside In Cold Blood by Michael Nations. The explanation of why two small-time ex-penitentiary convicts savagely killed 4 innocent Finney County, Kansas family members offered inside the pages of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood was due as a direct result of the psychological collapse of murderer Perry Edward Smith. Capote's 1965 published account details the apparent senseless murders of Herb Clutter, his wife Bonnie, daughter Nancy, and son Kenyon on November 15, 1959, and leads its reader to conclude that the horrible events that actually did take place that night would have never happened otherwise. Very real and escalating tensions between Smith and his partner in crime, Richard Eugene Hickok, while the two were inside the Clutter's home that night, combined with Smith's miserable life experiences that were laced with both personal tragedies and abuses, are the primary reasons offered by the In Cold Blood account to explain the two killers' behavior and actions taken towards their victims between midnight and 2 a.m. that desolate fall morning. Capote writes that a series of disappointed, thwarted, and unfulfilled perceptions simultaneously colliding inside Smith's mind that night was what triggered his rage to rise to a scale where murder was not only possible of the 4 bound and helpless victims, but indeed mandated the following 5 to 10 minute series of 4 shotgun blast explosions inside the Clutter home. Only the lifeless silence remained a sole companion to the now dead family members, who would be found later that morning by Sunday school friends stopping by the residence on their way to church. Is this really the entire and truthful account of what actually happened that night based on all available information at the time of the writing of In Cold Blood, or the result of a very shrewd, calculated, and carefully constructed story created by Capote, and the input that was provided to him by his powerful group of Kansas supporters and informants who were dedicated to the author and his book's eventual outcome. There was, however, a previous story authored and conveyed by Richard Eugene Hickok to my own father in the summer of 1961 that has not been heard. There is no public record available or any KSP prisoner visitation log associated with Richard Eugene Hickok's prison file to reflect even a trace of the countless personal interviews conducted between MACK Nations and killer Richard E. Hickok during the calendar year of 1961 at the Kansas State Penitentiary that year. Why? written correspondence that I found inside Hickok's KSB file in November 2012 at the Kansas State Historical Society in Topeka, Kansas, reflects that it was Hickok himself who had expressed his desire to have MACK Nations assist him in writing his life story, edit said story for publication, and then equally divide the proceeds from their joint venture afterwards. Hickok was the individual that advised Director of Kansas Penal Institutions, Colonel Guy Rexroad, in November 1961 of how arrangements were made with KSP Warden Tracy Hand, allowing nations the privilege of conducting such personal interviews with Hickok at the institution in order for the aforementioned plan of action to be achieved. Hickok would later tell his own story to many of the highest-ranking Kansas state officials, including 1964 Kansas Pardon Attorney Charles McAtee, 1965 appointed members of the Kansas Board of Parole and Probation, C.H. Looney, D.L. Yeagley, O.R. Stiles, and 1965 appointed Kansas Pardon Attorney P.A. Townsend, concerning the most intimate details related to the four heinous and unforgettable 1959 offenses that he not only planned but helped carry out. I offered the following 1961 handwritten documentation sent by Killer Richard Eugene Hickok to my father, STARLING MACK Nations, to be compared and contrasted with the story found in Capote's own 1965 completed version. The Hickok Nations letters would be used the same year by my father to compose a single version, unpublished manuscript titled High Road to Hell that included Richard Eugene Hickok's initials on every typed written page. According to Hickok's own words, written in Nations on May 14, 1961 from death row at KSP, both men had entered into a formal contract to write Hickok's life story on May 7, 1961. The same completed manuscript disappeared in December 1968 after my father's death in Colorado, and personal attempts by myself and other Nations family members to relocate it have been unsuccessful. What does remain are over 200 copy pages of the original handwritten version letters that Hickok mailed to Nations from his cell on death row during the calendar year 1961. Others are now invited to examine the same copied letters and render their own conclusions concerning their content. The May through June 1961 Hickok Nations letters not only detailed the actual murders committed by Smith and Hickok, but also include very significant and intricate pieces of Smith's and Hickok's thoughts and actions prior to the four murders being committed on November 15, 1959. The pair's 6-week escape, starting with their exodus from the United States into Mexico, followed by their return to California and journey across the American landscape from coast to coast before being arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada, and finally being transported back to Garden City, Kansas to be tried on 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and found guilty on March 29, 1960. Much of the following documentation has never previously been available for the public to review firsthand and afterwards be allowed to draw their own conclusions concerning the entire subject. However, what is now known and apparently been deliberately concealed from the public is that Kansas Assistant Attorney General Robert E. Hoffman contacted MACK Nations concerning the 1961 HICKOCK letters and requested that the original handwritten letters Nations had received from HICKOCK be made available for that official agency to review and inspect. This official request occurred early on in the winter of 1962, following Truman Capote's first visit on January 29, 1962, to KSP in Lansing, Kansas, to interview both Hickok and Smith, accompanied by Capote's close friend and associate, Nell Harper Lee. Capote had received special written permission with the help of Kansas State Representative Dale E. Saffolds to conduct his visit and interviews at the prison by then Colonel Guy Rexroth, Director of Kansas State Kansas Penal Institutions. Even though an earlier directive issued by the same Director Rexroth on October 9, 1961, expressly forbid any further such interviews or correspondence to be conducted with any KSP inmates by any authors, writers, or members of the press, including MACK Nations. According to Kurt R. Hoffman, Robert E. Hoffman's son, certified copies of the received original HICKOCK Nations letters were then made by his father, Kansas Assistant Attorney General Robert E. Hoffman, and retained inside that agency. Also, according to Kurt R. Hoffman, upon leaving his position in that same Kansas government agency, Robert E. Hoffman then took home with him a second copy he had reproduced of the HICKOCK Nations letters for his own personal use. I am completely unaware of any written permission that my father, Starling MACK Nations, ever issued to the office of the Kansas Attorney General or Robert E. Hoffman personally for any copies of the original HICKOCK Nations letters to be made, kept, or forwarded to any other persons. This is not what happened, and in June 2013, I became directly aware that Kurt R. Hoffman had been making more reproductions of the same HICKOCK Nations 1961 handwritten letters to make available to other individuals he was acquainted with. Upon discovering this startling revelation, I then called Mr. Hoffman and left a telephone voicemail message identifying myself as MACK Nation's son and requested that the copies that he had in his possession be returned to me. On the evening of July 2nd, 2003, On the evening of July 2nd, 2013, Kurt R. Hoffman called me from his home in Gardner, Kansas, concerning the matter. Mr. Hoffman advised me that he would mail me the same copies he had in his possession if I would email him my residential address information. This I did after our telephone conversation ended. I have yet to receive the promised copies of the original HICKOCK Nations letters from Mr. Hoffman some 2.5 years later. Became quite obvious to me while listening to Mr. Hoffman for some 30 minutes that he saw nothing improper or unethical about his father making the second copies of the HICKOCK Nations letters, taking them home as if the copied letters were his own personal property, and then for over the past 50-some years making additional copies for other individuals as though the private letters that actually belong as though the private letters actually belonged to the Hoffman family. How very ironic it seems to me now that those same copies made in 1962 inside the office of the Kansas Attorney General made their own peculiar path back to Starling Mack Nation's son in April 2013. I now present the text from those same original 1961 letters belonging to my father for anyone to examine and then compare side by side to the text which Truman Capote proclaimed in 1965 as being 100% accurate and based solely on his own ideas and extensive investigative research conducted into the subject. I'm going to take a break. Okay.